September 2nd, 31 BC. The Bay of Actium. The world holds its breath, not in silence, but in a deafening, hellish symphony of chaos. The air, thick and salty with the Ionian Sea, is rendered unbreathable by the acrid, sulphurous stench of Greek fire and the black smoke of burning pine from hundreds of quinqueremes, the behemoths of naval warfare, now transformed into floating funeral pyres. The sound is an inhuman chorus, the deep, percussive thud of Roman rams splintering the hulls of Egyptian ships, the splintering crackle of masts snapping like twigs under the weight of catapulted stones, and above it all, the ceaseless, high-pitched screams of thousands of men. Men burning, men drowning, men pierced by arrows and javelins. This is not a battle. It is an apocalypse at sea. The sunlight of a late summer afternoon is blotted out, replaced by a lurid, flickering orange glow that reflects off the crimson-slicked water. Amidst this floating inferno is the Antonia, the flagship of the Queen, a gilded monument to opulence now trapped in a vision of hell. From its deck, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, sees not just ships sinking, but her entire world dissolving into flame and smoke. She feels the percussive shock waves of distant impacts through the soles of her sandals, a tremor that seems to shake the very foundations of her ambition. The grand strategy, the union of East and West, the divine dream of a new world order with her as its Isis, is dying here, in the blood-choked waters off the coast of Greece. And it is in this moment of ultimate catastrophe that she makes a decision that will damn her in the eyes of history for 2 millennia. Her squadron, 60 ships held in reserve, suddenly hoists sail, catches the wind, and flees the carnage, abandoning the fight. This was the saga of a woman who gambled everything on the hearts of emperors, and this was the moment her gamble finally, irrevocably, failed. This is the narrative of her, Cleopatra VII Thea Philopator, the last in a 300-year line of Greek rulers on an Egyptian throne, the woman who held the fate of the Roman Republic in her hands not once, but twice. Her story is the ultimate paradox, a queen whose kingdom was a shadow of its former glory, a client state teetering on the edge of bankruptcy and annexation, who nevertheless challenged and nearly brought to heel the most powerful military machine the world had ever known. She did not command legions mighty enough to face Rome in the field. She did not possess a treasury that could outspend its coffers indefinitely. Her weapon was different. It was her mind, her will, and her calculated command over the affections of the 2 titans of her age, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The central, nagging question that echoes down through the centuries is why? Why did she choose this perilous path of entwining the personal with the political, of staking her dynasty's survival on the volatile emotions of powerful men? Was her smile, the smile that supposedly conquered the world, a mask for the iciest of political calculations, a tool wielded with the precision of an assassin's blade? Or was she a woman who, in her boundless ambition and belief in her own divinity, truly loved the men she sought to control, believing that through genuine passion she could forge a new destiny for her people and herself? To understand the woman who played with the hearts of emperors, we must first understand the broken, violent, and magnificent world that created her. A world where love was just another word for power. To understand this queen, we must return to the world of the 1st century before the birth of Christ, a world convulsed by change and staggering under the weight of its own overgrown ambitions. The great geopolitical chessboard was in a state of violent flux, and the old pieces were being swept away. In the West, the Roman Republic, that once stoic model of civic virtue, was in its death throes, tearing itself apart in a century of brutal civil wars. Generals had become warlords, their legions loyal not to the Senate, but to the man who paid them. Men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar carved up the known world, their personal ambitions drowning the Republic in blood. The very idea of Rome was at a breaking point, transitioning from a city-state that governed an empire to an empire that needed an emperor. Far to the east, the Parthian Empire loomed, a formidable and wealthy rival, the only power capable of meeting Roman legions on equal terms and a constant thorn in the side of Roman ambitions. Between these two behemoths lay the remnants of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the once glorious successors to the empire of Alexander the Great. They were now hollowed out, decadent, and ripe for the picking. And the richest, most ancient, and most tempting of them all was Egypt. For Rome, Egypt was the ultimate prize. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, its staggering grain harvests capable of feeding Rome's volatile and ever-hungry population. Its treasury, though depleted, was still legendary, a source of the ready cash needed to fund Rome's endless wars. It was strategically vital, a gateway to Africa and the Red Sea trade routes. Yet, it was militarily feeble, its army a pale shadow of the Ptolemaic war machine of centuries past. Egypt was, in the cold language of Roman realpolitik, a golden pear hanging from a rotten branch, waiting for the strongest hand to pluck it. This was the precarious inheritance of Cleopatra, to be the ruler of a kingdom that was simultaneously too rich to be ignored and too weak to defend itself from the shark-infested waters of Roman politics. She was not a player in the great game. She was a piece on the board, and her survival depended on changing the rules of the game itself. Her character was forged not in the heat of battle, but in the perfumed, poisoned, and paranoid atmosphere of the royal palace in Alexandria. This city was her first and greatest teacher. Alexandria was not just a city, it was the crucible of civilization, the intellectual and cultural capital of the world. The unimaginable wealth of its great library, holding the accumulated knowledge of humanity, existed alongside the cutthroat commerce of its ports, where goods and ideas from as far as India mingled with the philosophies of Greece and the ancient mysticism of Egypt. The air itself was a symphony of languages and cultures. This cosmopolitan environment shaped her mind, giving her a global perspective her Roman adversaries, for all their power, often lacked. But within the palace walls, a different lesson was taught daily: the lesson of survival. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a nest of vipers, a family whose history was written in the blood of its own members. For 3 centuries, brother had murdered brother, sister had overthrown sister, and spouses had routinely poisoned one another for the throne. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, mockingly called Auletes, the flute player, was a weak and ineffective ruler who had survived only by shamelessly bribing Roman senators and generals, bankrupting his kingdom to cling to his throne, a humiliation Cleopatra witnessed firsthand. She learned from his failures that weakness was a death sentence and that power, especially within her own family, was the deadliest of poisons. It was in this environment that she honed her intellect into a weapon. Unlike most of her predecessors, who were content to speak only Greek, the language of the court, Cleopatra, as Plutarch writes, mastered numerous tongues. She spoke to the Egyptians in their own language, to the Ethiopians, the Hebrews, the Arabs, and the Syrians in theirs. This was not a mere academic exercise. It was a profound political tool. It allowed her to bypass her courtiers and connect directly with her subjects and foreign emissaries, to charm, to persuade, and to understand the nuances of their thinking in a way no Roman could. This fusion of a razor-sharp, multilingual intellect, a deep education in rhetoric and philosophy, and the brutal first-hand knowledge of dynastic survival, all steeped in the divine mystique of an Egyptian pharaoh, created a woman who was uniquely equipped for the dangerous game she was about to play. She was not merely a Greek queen, she was the incarnation of a goddess, and she was about to remind the world of that fact. The first move in her great game was not one of regal splendor or seductive charm, but of grit, desperation, and raw courage, a testament to the iron will forged in the Alexandrian palace. At around the age of 18, she was driven from her own capital, exiled by the powerful court eunuchs who controlled her younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIII. In the patriarchal world of Hellenistic monarchies, an intelligent and ambitious young woman was a threat to be managed, and the faction around her brother chose the simplest solution: removal. A lesser royal would have accepted this fate, seeking a quiet, comfortable exile in another Greek city, living out her days as a forgotten pawn. But Cleopatra was not a lesser royal. She saw this not as a defeat, but as an intolerable insult to her divine right to rule. Instead of fleeing west towards the relative safety of the Mediterranean, she did the unexpected. She fled east into the harsh, unforgiving deserts of the Sinai and Syria. This was a land of nomads, mercenaries, and frontier garrisons, a world away from the marbled halls of Alexandria. Here, a teenage girl, a deposed queen with little more than her name and a few loyal attendants, began to build an army. This act alone was revolutionary. She used her family's remaining connections, and more importantly, her own charisma and linguistic skills, to persuade and recruit Arab tribal leaders and mercenary captains to her cause. Imagine the scene. This young woman, raised in the lap of luxury, now haggling with grizzled soldiers in their own tongues, sleeping in tents under the desert stars, proving her mettle not through proclamations, but through sheer, bloody-minded determination. She was demonstrating, to her enemies and to the world, that she would not be swept from the board. She was her own player, willing to endure immense hardship to reclaim what was hers. By the time Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, in pursuit of his defeated rival Pompey, Cleopatra was not a distant, exiled princess. She was a military commander with an army at her back, encamped just outside the city, preparing to wage a civil war against her brother. Her first step into the great game was not an appeal for aid, but a declaration of intent, a clear signal that the Queen of Egypt was a force to be reckoned with, one who made her own armies and her own fate. This defiant stand in the desert set the stage for everything that was to come. Beneath the calculated political maneuvering, the linguistic prowess, and the iron will, there was a deeper, more powerful current that drove Cleopatra. A burning, almost fanatical ambition to restore the glory of her dynasty and, by extension, the world she believed she was destined to command. This was not merely the standard ambition of a monarch to hold on to power. It was a profound and deeply personal quest, a secret motivation that bordered on a divine mandate. She was the inheritor of a fading legacy. The empire of the Ptolemies, which had once stretched from Libya to Syria, the naval superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean, had been in a state of humiliating decline for over a century. It had lost territory, prestige, and most importantly, its autonomy. Her immediate predecessors, including her own father, had ruled as little more than puppets of Rome, bleeding the kingdom dry to pay for Roman protection. Cleopatra felt this shame in her bones. She saw herself not just as a queen, but as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the divine mother, healer, and ruler of the universe. This was not simple propaganda. All evidence suggests she believed it profoundly. By identifying with Isis, she was tapping into a power far older and, in her view, more legitimate than the brutish military might of Rome. Her goal was a grand restoration. She envisioned a new Hellenistic Egyptian empire, a partnership of equals with Rome, or perhaps even its master, with Alexandria, not Rome, as its spiritual and cultural center. This was the dream she was chasing. Her relationship with Caesar, and later Antony, was the means to achieve this end. In them, she saw not just lovers or protectors, but the mortal vessels of a power she could harness for her own divine purpose. Caesarion, her son by Caesar, was not just a child. He was the Horus to her Isis, the divinely conceived heir who would unite the lineage of Alexander the all-conquering Greek with the might of Caesar, the all-conquering Roman. This inner demon of ambition, this unshakable belief in her own godhood and historical destiny, is what allowed her to take such audacious risks. She was not just trying to save a kingdom. She was trying to reshape the world in her own divine image, a goal so colossal that it made any gamble, no matter how dangerous, seem not only reasonable, but necessary. The entire course of history can pivot on a single, audacious act, a moment of such theatrical genius that it rips up the script of conventional politics. For Cleopatra, that moment was her arrival in the presence of Gaius Julius Caesar. The scene is the stuff of legend, but its political brilliance is often lost in the romance. Caesar, the 52-year-old master of the world, fresh from his victory over Pompey at Pharsalus, had established himself in the royal palace at Alexandria in October of 48 BC. He was attempting to mediate the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII, but he was only meeting with her brother's faction. Cleopatra was effectively locked out, a queen in her own kingdom unable to even approach the Roman arbiter who held her fate in his hands. A direct assault was impossible. Her brother's forces controlled the harbor and the city. A formal request for a meeting would be intercepted and denied by her enemies at court. So she conceived of a plan that was equal parts desperate, daring, and dazzling. According to Plutarch, she took a small boat, accompanied only by a trusted Sicilian servant named Apollodorus, and landed near the palace under the cover of darkness. It was here that the legendary subterfuge took place. To smuggle herself past the enemy guards, she laid herself out full length inside a roll of bedding or a carpet. The Greek word stegane can mean either, which Apollodorus then tied up and carried on his shoulders right through the palace gates. He walked past the sentries, who saw only a servant carrying a bundle for the Roman general, and deposited his precious cargo at Caesar's feet. As the carpet was unrolled, the 21-year-old queen emerged, not as a desperate refugee, but as a dramatic, almost magical apparition. This was not the act of a supplicant. This was a statement. She had bypassed her enemy's armies and her brother's guards. She had penetrated the heart of Roman power. She had demonstrated her resourcefulness, her courage, and her complete disregard for convention. She was not just asking for Caesar's help. She was presenting herself as his equal in daring and intellect, a worthy partner in the game of power. Caesar, a man who appreciated audacity and spectacle above all else, was reportedly captivated. He had spent a career dealing with calculating senators and brutish rival generals. He had never encountered anyone like her. This fateful encounter was the beginning of the alliance that would change the world. It placed Cleopatra on the throne of Egypt, gave Caesar the funding he needed to continue his political wars, and produced a son, Caesarion, who represented a potential future that terrified the Roman establishment. It all began with one roll of a carpet. Securing the throne with Caesar's help was one thing, holding it was another, and the price of her power was paid in the blood and fire of the Alexandrian War. This was no simple palace coup. It was a brutal 9-month conflict that raged through the streets and waterways of her own capital city from late 48 to early 47 BC. Once Caesar sided with her, the forces loyal to her brother Ptolemy III, commanded by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, laid siege to the royal palace where Caesar and Cleopatra were quartered. The conflict was a vicious, close-quarters struggle. Roman legionaries, masters of open-field battle, found themselves fighting in narrow alleys and on rooftops against a hostile urban population. The war reached a terrifying crescendo when, in a desperate attempt to gain control of the harbor, Caesar's forces set fire to the Egyptian fleet. The flames, whipped by the sea breeze, spread uncontrollably, engulfing parts of the city, and, in an act of incalculable loss to human heritage, damaging the great library. For Cleopatra, this must have been a vision of hell. The very heart of her kingdom, the center of global knowledge she so cherished, was burning as a direct result of the alliance she had forged to save her crown. She was a frontline witness to the terrifying, destructive power of Roman warfare. She saw firsthand that Roman friendship could be as devastating as Roman enmity. This war hardened her. She saw her younger sister, Arsinoe, join the rebels and declare herself queen. She saw her brother, Ptolemy III, ultimately defeated and drowned in the Nile, weighed down by his own golden armor. She had won, but her victory was soaked in the blood of her own siblings and the ashes of her own city. The price of her alliance with Caesar was to bind Egypt's destiny to the violent, unpredictable currents of Roman politics. She was no longer just a Hellenistic queen. She was a Roman client, her throne propped up by Roman swords. From this moment on, her survival and the survival of her kingdom would depend entirely on her ability to manage, manipulate, and master the brutal game of Roman power, a game whose deadly rules had just been written in fire across the sky of Alexandria. The greatest single antagonist to Cleopatra's ambition was not a rival queen or a Parthian king, but an idea, an institution, the Roman Senate. While individuals like her brother, or later Octavian, were her direct opponents, it was the collective power and deep-seated ideology of the Roman aristocracy that posed the most fundamental threat to her existence and her dreams. To the old guard of the Republic, the powerful senators from ancient families, men like Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator, and Cato the Younger, the unbending Stoic, Cleopatra represented everything they feared and despised. In their eyes, she was, first and foremost, a rex, a king, or in her case, a queen. The Roman Republic had been founded on the violent overthrow of a king, and for 500 years, the title was the ultimate political taboo, synonymous with tyranny and autocracy. The fact that their own generals, like Caesar, were now behaving like kings was a source of deep anxiety, and Cleopatra, a living, breathing, ruling monarch, was the ultimate symbol of this terrifying trend. Furthermore, she was foreign. She was Greek, an Egyptian, a product of the East, which in the Roman imagination was a place of decadent luxury, effeminate weakness, and strange, corrupting magics. The senators saw her influence over Caesar not as a political alliance, but as a form of witchcraft, a sinister seduction that was weakening his Roman character and drawing him towards the tyrannical model of an Eastern despot. When she came to Rome in 46 BC and lived in Caesar's villa, she caused a profound scandal. She was a walking, talking affront to Roman tradition, mos maiorum. Her statue, gilded and placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix by Caesar, was seen as an act of sacrilege, placing a foreign mistress among the gods of Rome. Cicero's letters seethe with contempt for her, calling her arrogant and disdainful. For these men, she was not a strategic partner, but a cancer on the body politic of Rome. Her ultimate goal, the creation of a new, grand Hellenistic empire, possibly ruled from Alexandria, with her divine right monarchy supplanting the Roman Republic, was their worst nightmare. They were fighting a desperate rearguard action to save their dying republic, and Cleopatra, with her immense wealth, her ancient lineage, and her dangerous influence over Rome's most powerful man, was the living embodiment of the despotic, monarchical future they would kill to prevent. The Ides of March, 44 BC. A date that has echoed through history as a byword for betrayal and the violent death of ambition. For Cleopatra, residing in splendor in Caesar's villa on the outskirts of Rome, the news of his assassination was not just a political setback. It was an earthquake that shattered the foundations of her world. This was her first and most profound catastrophe, a psychological breaking point that taught her the most brutal lesson about Roman politics. That no amount of power, not even Caesar's, could protect a man from a well-placed knife, and that any strategy built around a single individual was fatally flawed. In a matter of hours, she went from being the most influential woman in the world, the cherished partner of a man on the verge of becoming a king, to a vulnerable foreigner in a city suddenly seized by violent uncertainty. Her protector was gone. The father of her beloved son, Caesarion, the boy she hoped would one day unite Rome and Egypt, was a bloody corpse on the floor of the Senate House. Her status in Rome evaporated instantly. She was no longer a respected visiting monarch. She was the hated foreign mistress of a dead tyrant, a symbol of everything the assassins claimed to be fighting against. Her life and the life of her son were in immediate danger. The political atmosphere in Rome was toxic, a chaotic swirl of competing factions. The assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, and Caesar's enraged supporters, soon to be led by Mark Antony and Caesar's young, unknown heir, Octavian. There was no place for her in this new, violent equation. She had to flee, escaping from Rome back to the relative safety of Alexandria. The journey home must have been one of terror and grim realization. Her entire grand strategy, built over years of patient diplomacy and personal sacrifice, had been predicated on Caesar's life and power. With him gone, the dream of a joint Roman-Egyptian empire was dead. She had learned that Roman power was not monolithic. It was a chaotic, multi-headed beast. To survive, she would have to learn to navigate its treacherous internal conflicts, to play its factions against each other. The assassination of Caesar was the end of her first great gamble, but it was also the beginning of a new, colder, and more cynical education in the art of survival. The queen who returned to Alexandria was warier, harder, and more determined than ever not to be a pawn in anyone's game again. As Rome descended into the fresh hell of another civil war, a conflict pitting Caesar's assassins against his avengers, Cleopatra executed a masterful display of strategic patience, turning the chaos that had engulfed her benefactor into a golden opportunity. While the new titans of Rome, the fiery Mark Antony, the cold and calculating Octavian, and the hapless Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate and began hunting their enemies, Cleopatra withdrew to her kingdom and played a waiting game. Egypt became an island of stability and neutrality in a world tearing itself apart. This was an incredibly shrewd move. Both sides in the Roman conflict desperately needed what she had: money and grain. The triumvirs needed funds to pay their vast armies, and the assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, who had seized control of the eastern provinces, needed resources to challenge them. Delegations from both factions came to Alexandria, begging for her support. Cleopatra, however, had learned the hard lesson of hitching her wagon to a single star. Instead of committing fully to either side, she played them off against each other, offering just enough support to keep them interested, while preserving the bulk of her kingdom's immense wealth. She sent her fleet, ostensibly to help the triumvirs, but claimed it was conveniently diverted by storms. She allowed some of her officials to aid Cassius, but denied any official sanction. She was walking a political tightrope, using the chaos of the Roman civil war as a shield. While her Roman suitors were busy slaughtering each other on the fields of Philippi in 42 BC, she was consolidating her power at home, stabilizing the Egyptian economy, and building up the resources that she knew the eventual victor would come for. She understood a fundamental truth of power. In a time of total war, the one who controls the resources controls the future. When the dust settled at Philippi and the triumvirs stood victorious, Mark Antony, the new master of the East, summoned the Queen of Egypt to Tarsus to answer for her ambiguous loyalties. The summons was meant to intimidate, to put the client queen in her place. But Cleopatra saw it not as a threat, but as the opportunity she had been waiting for. The chaos had created a power vacuum, and a new great man now ruled the East. It was time to begin the game again. The meeting at Tarsus in 41 BC was not a diplomatic summit. It was a carefully staged act of psychological warfare, the absolute pinnacle of Cleopatra's genius for political theater and her single greatest triumph. Mark Antony, the victor of Philippi, the greatest general of his age, a man of legendary appetites and epic emotions, had summoned a client queen to explain herself. He expected a nervous supplicant. Instead, he got a goddess. Cleopatra orchestrated her arrival not as an answer to a summons, but as a divine visitation. She sailed up the Cydnus River not in a warship, but in a magnificent river barge with a gilded stern, purple sails, the color of royalty, and silver oars that beat time to the music of flutes, pipes, and harps. This was the opening salvo in her sensory assault. She herself was the centerpiece of this breathtaking tableau. She lay under a gold-spangled canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, surrounded by attendants costumed as Nereids, Graces, and Cupids. The perfumes from the incense burning on the barge were so potent, Plutarch writes, that they wafted ahead to the banks of the river, announcing her arrival to the crowds that had gathered to witness the spectacle. She completely upstaged Antony. He sat waiting in the public marketplace, expecting to hold court, only to find the entire population of Tarsus had abandoned him to run to the river and gaze upon this incredible sight. He was left sitting alone. The power dynamic was instantly inverted. She was no longer the one being summoned. She was the one issuing the invitations, playfully requesting that the Roman general come and dine with her, the goddess. That night, and for several nights following, she hosted him in a series of banquets of such opulence and splendor that they beggared the imagination of the Romans. This was not just seduction, it was a masterful demonstration of power. She was showing Antony, a man who loved grandeur, that her wealth and sophistication dwarfed anything he had seen. She was appealing not just to his famed libido, but to his ego, his ambition, and his love of the epic. She presented herself not as a conquered subject of Rome, but as the heir to an ancient, wealthy, and divine civilization, offering him a partnership in a world far more magnificent than the bitter, backstabbing politics of the Senate. At Tarsus, Cleopatra did not just win an ally. She captured the heart and soul of the man who controlled half the Roman world, binding him to her destiny with chains of gold and silk. The psychological culmination of this triumphant union occurred several years later, in the autumn of 34 BC, in an audacious public ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. This event, more than any other, reveals the sheer scale of Cleopatra's ambition and the heady moment of hubris that marked the zenith of her power. In the heart of her capital, in the city's gymnasium, two massive golden thrones were erected on a silver platform. Upon one sat Mark Antony, and on the other, Cleopatra, dressed in the sacred robes of the goddess Isis. Before the assembled crowds of Alexandria, they presented themselves not merely as political allies, but as a divine couple, Osiris and Isis, rulers of a new world order. Below them, on smaller thrones, sat their children, the 16-year-old Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, and the 3 children she had with Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. What followed was a political bombshell that shook the foundations of the Roman world. Antony, acting with the authority of a Roman triumvir, officially proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings and confirmed her as the rightful ruler of Egypt, Cyprus, and parts of Syria. He then declared Caesarion to be the true, legitimate son and heir of the divine Julius Caesar, a direct and mortal challenge to his rival Octavian, whose entire claim to power rested on being Caesar's adopted son. But the donations did not stop there. Antony proceeded to distribute the vast eastern territories of the Roman Republic, lands he had not even fully conquered, as kingdoms for his children with Cleopatra. Alexander Helios was named king of Armenia, Parthia, and Media. Ptolemy Philadelphus was made king of Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. Their sister, Cleopatra Selene, was to be the ruler of Cyrenaica and Libya. This was a revolutionary redrawing of the map. In her mind, this was the moment her grandest dream became reality. She was no longer a Roman client. She was the empress of a vast Eastern empire, the matriarch of a new dynasty that would rule for generations. She had not only saved Egypt, she had elevated it, creating a powerful Hellenistic counterweight to Rome, bound together by personal loyalty to her family. For a fleeting, glorious moment, sitting on that golden throne, she must have believed she had won the great game entirely. But this spectacular triumph was also a catastrophic miscalculation, an act of such profound arrogance that it would provide her sworn enemy with all the ammunition he needed to destroy her. Every great protagonist is defined by their antagonist, and for Cleopatra, the divine, passionate, and theatrical queen, her ultimate nemesis was a man who was her polar opposite in every conceivable way: Gaius Octavius, the future Emperor Augustus. Octavian was the embodiment of cold, patient, and ruthless calculation. While Antony was a man of grand appetites and fiery emotions, Octavian was abstemious, disciplined, and possessed of an icy self-control that unnerved all who met him. His personal drama was the driving force of his life. He was the great-nephew of Julius Caesar, a sickly and overlooked teenager who, upon Caesar's assassination, discovered he had been posthumously adopted as Caesar's son and heir. This unexpected inheritance thrust him into the heart of Roman power politics, where he was initially dismissed by seasoned players like Cicero and Antony as a mere boy. This constant underestimation forged in him a relentless determination to prove himself worthy of the name Caesar and to avenge his adoptive father. His entire political identity was built on being the rightful heir, the one chosen to carry on Caesar's legacy. And this is why Cleopatra and her son Caesarion represented such a mortal threat to him. Caesarion was Caesar's biological son, a direct challenge to the legitimacy Octavian had built his entire career on. Cleopatra, the foreign queen who had bewitched first his father and now his rival Antony, became the focus of all his political venom. He was a master of propaganda, and he used Cleopatra as a tool to destroy Antony's reputation in Rome. He skillfully painted the affair not as a political alliance, but as a sordid enslavement. He portrayed Antony as a drunken, decadent Roman who had gone native, abandoning his Roman heritage and duties to become the effeminate plaything of the Egyptian witch. He circulated stories, likely exaggerated or fabricated, of Antony's subservience, of him dressing in Greek clothes and participating in strange Egyptian religious rites. Octavian positioned himself as the champion of Roman tradition, of austerity, of family values, all the things Antony and Cleopatra's opulent cosmopolitan partnership seemed to defy. His war was not just for territory, it was a culture war, a struggle for the very soul of Rome. He was fighting to restore the old, rigid, masculine order of the Republic, and to do that, he had to utterly destroy the seductive, powerful, and dangerously feminine alternative that Cleopatra represented. Lost amidst the epic tales of romance and war is the story of Cleopatra the Administrator, a capable and diligent ruler who, for over 2 decades, governed a complex and often fractious kingdom. While her relationships with Caesar and Antony were the cornerstones of her foreign policy, her domestic achievements were crucial for maintaining the stability and resources she needed to play on the world stage. Unlike many of her late Ptolemaic predecessors, who had treated Egypt as a personal piggy bank to be exploited, Cleopatra appears to have taken her role as pharaoh seriously, demonstrating a genuine concern for the welfare of her subjects. One of her most significant achievements was stabilizing the Egyptian economy. She inherited a kingdom on the brink of bankruptcy, largely due to her father's massive bribes to Rome. She implemented economic reforms, managed the currency, and appears to have skillfully navigated Egypt's complex bureaucracy of scribes and officials. Her reign was a period of relative prosperity and stability after decades of decline. Crucially, she was perhaps the first Ptolemaic ruler to truly bridge the gap between the Greek ruling class and the native Egyptian population. Her ability to speak the Egyptian language was a political masterstroke. It allowed her to engage directly with the Egyptian priesthood, a powerful and influential institution, and to present herself not as a foreign Greek overlord, but as a true pharaoh, the rightful heir to a 3,000-year-old tradition. During a severe famine caused by a low Nile flood, ancient sources record that she opened the royal granaries to feed the people, a populist move that would have earned her immense loyalty. She was a prolific builder and patron of the arts, continuing the grand Ptolemaic tradition of embellishing Alexandria and other cities. This image of Cleopatra as a competent and caring ruler is a vital counterpoint to the Roman propaganda that depicted her solely as a decadent seductress. Her people did not see her as a foreign witch. They saw her as a protector, the incarnation of Isis who had brought stability and who was fighting to preserve Egyptian independence against the ever-expanding power of Rome. This internal support was her bedrock. The wealth she generated and the loyalty she commanded were the very resources that made her such a valuable ally and such a formidable foe. For Cleopatra, her children were not merely the objects of maternal affection. They were the living, breathing instruments of her dynastic ambition. the cornerstones of the future she was trying to build. Each child represented a crucial piece of her grand geopolitical strategy. The most important, of course, was Ptolemy Caesar, better known as Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar. In him, she saw the perfect synthesis of East and West, the ultimate heir. He was the biological son of the greatest Roman of them all, and through her, the descendant of Alexander the Great and the pharaohs of Egypt. His very existence was a claim to a universal monarchy that would bridge the Mediterranean. He was her ace in the hole, the living proof of her special relationship with Caesar, and a constant, nagging threat to Octavian's legitimacy. She named him her co-ruler, reinforcing his status and grooming him to one day command the empire she envisioned. Her 3 children with Mark Antony were also strategic assets, each destined for a throne. The twins, Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon, had names that dripped with cosmic and royal ambition. Alexander was named for the great conqueror, signaling a revival of Hellenistic glory in the East. In the donations of Alexandria, he was made the future king of a vast territory, stretching from Armenia to Parthia, a clear statement of intent to challenge Rome's eastern frontier. His sister, Cleopatra Selene, was given control of territories to the west of Egypt, creating a solid block of Ptolemaic power in North Africa. The youngest, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was assigned the lands of Syria and Phoenicia, securing the Levant and re-establishing the old Ptolemaic sphere of influence. Through her children, Cleopatra was weaving a web of kingdoms, a network of family alliances that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean and be loyal not to Rome, but to her. They were the future rulers of her restored empire, a physical manifestation of the union between her Egyptian dynasty and the military power of Rome, represented by Antony. This is why their fate was so tragic. After her death, Octavian ruthlessly hunted down and executed Caesarion, correctly identifying him as the most dangerous threat to his rule. The other children were spared, paraded in his triumph in Rome, and raised by his sister Octavia, living reminders of a future that almost was. The first serious cracks in the magnificent edifice Cleopatra and Antony were building appeared not in the perfumed halls of Alexandria, but in the frozen mountains of Parthia in 36 BC. Antony, seeking to bolster his military credentials and rival the legendary achievements of Caesar and Alexander, launched a massive invasion of the Parthian Empire. It was a campaign funded almost entirely by Cleopatra's Egyptian treasury. The plan was ambitious, but the execution was a disaster. Antony's legions, numbering around 100,000 men, plunged deep into enemy territory, only to have their supply lines cut and their siege train captured. Harassed constantly by Parthian horse archers and suffering through a brutal early winter, the Roman army was forced into a long and nightmarish retreat. It was a military catastrophe of the first order. Antony lost more than 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, a significant portion of his military strength, and he returned to Egypt not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a defeated and humiliated general. This defeat had devastating consequences. Militarily, it severely weakened Antony's position, leaving him more dependent than ever on Cleopatra's resources to rebuild his shattered legions. Politically, it was a propaganda gift of immense proportions for Octavian in Rome. Antony's enemies in the Senate could now portray him as an incompetent commander, a man whose skills had been dulled by years of Eastern luxury and his obsession with the Egyptian queen. Octavian's propagandists worked overtime, spreading the narrative that Antony had abandoned Roman military discipline, that his judgment was clouded, and that he had recklessly sacrificed Roman lives for his own glory. The Parthian disaster was the first harbinger of the storm to come. It tarnished Antony's reputation, drained Cleopatra's coffers, and gave their sworn enemy the perfect weapon to turn Roman public opinion against them. The dream of a grand Eastern empire was built on the foundation of Antony's military prowess. When that foundation began to crack, the entire structure became dangerously unstable. It was a sobering lesson that Egyptian gold could not always guarantee Roman victory. In the high-stakes game of Roman politics, personal relationships were political statements, and no act was more politically charged than marriage. In 37 BC, Antony had entered into a political marriage with Octavia the Younger, the sister of his rival Octavian. Octavia was a respected Roman matron, the embodiment of traditional Roman female virtue, and the marriage was intended to publicly seal the fragile peace between the two most powerful men in Rome. For several years, Antony lived with her, and she bore him 2 daughters. But his heart and his political future lay in the east, with Cleopatra. In 32 BC, he made a fateful and catastrophic decision. He sent a letter to Rome, formally and publicly divorcing Octavia. This act was the point of no return. Psychologically, it may have been a declaration of his genuine love for Cleopatra, a desire to end the charade and commit himself wholly to the woman and the world he had chosen. He may have believed his power was so secure that he no longer needed the political cover of a Roman marriage. But politically, it was an act of self-immolation. In Rome, the divorce was seen as the ultimate insult, not just to the virtuous Octavia, but to her brother Octavian and to the Roman state itself. It was perceived as a public rejection of Roman tradition in favor of a foreign, mystical, and morally suspect relationship. Octavian, the master manipulator of public opinion, seized on this moment with glee. This was the casus belli, the justification for war that he had been desperately seeking. He framed the coming conflict not as another sordid Roman civil war, the Roman people were weary of those, but as a noble, patriotic war against a foreign enemy. The enemy was not Antony, he claimed, but the ambitious Egyptian queen who had corrupted a great Roman general and now sought to rule the empire from Alexandria. The divorce gave Octavian the moral high ground. He was able to read Antony's will aloud to the Senate, a will that reportedly acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's heir, and asked to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra, as proof of his betrayal. The fateful act of divorcing Octavia was the key that unlocked the final war. It was a personal decision that had global political consequences, a psychological error born of overconfidence and passion that delivered Antony and Cleopatra directly into their enemies' hands. The Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC, was not merely a naval engagement. It was the climactic, world-changing final act in a drama that had been playing out for decades. It was here that the futures of Rome and Egypt collided and were decided in a few short, brutal hours. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet, a massive force of around 500 ships, was blockaded inside the Ambracian Gulf by the smaller but more agile fleet of Octavian, commanded by his brilliant general, Marcus Agrippa. Antony's ships were behemoths, floating fortresses with huge towers, bristling with catapults and manned by thousands of soldiers. Agrippa's ships were lighter, faster Liburnian galleys, designed for ramming and outmaneuvering their larger opponents. The decisive moment of the battle is shrouded in controversy and propaganda. As the fighting raged, with Agrippa's smaller ships swarming the larger Antonian vessels like wolf packs, a critical event occurred. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, which had been held in the rear, suddenly hoisted sails, a strange act in a battle fought primarily with oars, and broke through the lines, fleeing south towards Egypt. The reasons for this are fiercely debated. Was it a pre-planned escape, an act of cowardice, or a strategic withdrawal gone wrong? The most devastating part of this maneuver was what happened next. Mark Antony, seeing Cleopatra's flagship sailing away, abandoned his own massive flagship, transferred to a smaller, faster vessel, and followed her, leaving his entire army and fleet to their fate. The psychological effect of this was catastrophic. The leaderless fleet, though still powerful, fought on for a few more hours before surrendering. A week later, Antony's formidable land army, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered to Octavian without a fight. Actium was an unmitigated disaster. It was the greatest catastrophe of their lives, the complete and total destruction of their military power in a single afternoon. Whether it was a failure of nerve, a breakdown in communication, or a desperate, selfish gamble to save themselves, the result was the same. In that single, fateful act of retreat, they had lost everything: their army, their fleet, their political legitimacy, and ultimately, the world they had dreamed of ruling together. The aftermath of Actium was a slow, agonizing collapse, a descent into psychological despair and political irrelevance. The year between the battle and their final deaths in Alexandria was a long, drawn-out funeral for their ambitions. They returned to the Egyptian capital not as conquering divine rulers, but as defeated fugitives. Mark Antony, the man who had commanded legions and dominated half the world, completely disintegrated. He fell into a deep, alcoholic depression, shunning Cleopatra and living as a hermit in a structure he had built by the harbor, which he called his Timonium, after a legendary Athenian misanthrope who hated all mankind. He was a broken man, consumed by shame, rage, and the knowledge of his utter failure. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, reacted differently. While she surely felt the despair, her first instinct was survival, not necessarily for herself, but for her children and her dynasty. She began a series of desperate, last-ditch attempts to salvage something from the wreckage. She sent emissaries to Octavian, offering to abdicate in favor of her children. She even, according to some Roman sources, secretly offered to have Antony assassinated in exchange for her kingdom's safety. Octavian, cold and implacable, had no intention of negotiating. He wanted total victory, and he wanted Egypt's treasury. As his legions advanced inexorably across North Africa and down through Syria in the summer of 30 BC, the final collapse began. Antony's remaining forces, the garrisons and client kings he had counted as loyal, deserted him one by one. When Octavian's army finally appeared before the gates of Alexandria, the last of Antony's troops surrendered or defected. Hearing a false report, deliberately spread by Cleopatra herself, that she had committed suicide, Antony fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, but not yet dead, he was brought to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself with her treasures. He died in her arms, a pathetic and tragic end for the man who had been her partner in challenging the world. With Antony gone, Cleopatra was alone, a queen with no army, no allies, and no hope, facing the man who had destroyed her world. Her last chance was not to win, but to control the manner of her defeat. The final act of Cleopatra's life was her masterpiece, a meticulously staged and utterly defiant performance that transformed a military defeat into a legendary victory over her conqueror. Captured and held under guard in her palace, she knew what awaited her. Octavian's plan was clear. He intended to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, the ultimate humiliation for a foreign monarch. She would be the star exhibit in his celebration, a living symbol of his victory and the conquest of Egypt. For Cleopatra, a woman who had lived her entire life as a queen and a goddess, this fate was worse than death. She would not be an object of scorn and pity for a Roman mob. So she played her final card. She requested, and was granted, permission to perform the last rites at Antony's tomb. Then she returned to her chambers, bathed and dressed in her finest royal regalia, the robes of Isis. She sat down to a sumptuous final meal. According to the classical accounts, it was at this point that a servant arrived with a basket of figs, which the guards inspected and let through. Hidden beneath the figs were asps, small, venomous snakes whose bite was a sacred symbol in ancient Egyptian religion, the instrument by which pharaohs were said to achieve immortality and join the gods. Her death was a carefully managed piece of political theater. When Octavian's guards burst into the room, they found her dead on her golden couch, dressed as a queen, with her two loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, dying at her feet. Charmian, with her last breath, was said to be adjusting the diadem on her mistress's head. Cleopatra had denied Octavian his ultimate prize. He could conquer her kingdom, seize her treasury, and murder her son, but he could not possess her. He could not break her spirit. By choosing the time and manner of her own death, and by using the sacred asp of the pharaohs, she crafted her own final narrative. She died not as a captive Roman prisoner, but as the last queen of Egypt, performing her final divine ritual, an act of ultimate defiance that cheated her enemy and secured her immortality in legend. The legacy of Cleopatra is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a testament to the power of propaganda to shape history. For 2,000 years, her image has been contested, rewritten, and reimagined to suit the needs of the age. The primary and most enduring interpretation is the one crafted by her nemesis, Octavian, and the Roman historians who wrote under the patronage of his new imperial regime. In this version, the official story of the victor, Cleopatra is the ultimate villainess, the foreign seductress, the serpent of the Nile, a decadent and immoral sorceress who used her sexual wiles to corrupt two of Rome's greatest generals. She is a symbol of Eastern licentiousness and a cautionary tale against the dangers of powerful women. This is the Cleopatra of the Roman poets Horace and Propertius, and it is this image that echoed down through the centuries, most famously immortalized by William Shakespeare, whose Antony and Cleopatra presents her as a tempestuous, infinitely fascinating, but ultimately destructive force. This Roman narrative almost completely erased the other side of the story. From an Egyptian perspective, she was a profoundly different figure. She was the last independent pharaoh, the final defender of a 3,000-year-old civilization against the relentless expansion of Roman imperialism. She was a competent administrator who brought stability and prosperity, a scholar who respected and patronized Egyptian culture, and a mother fighting to secure a future for her children and her people. In the modern era, particularly in the Arab world and among feminist historians, her image has been reclaimed and rehabilitated. She is seen as a powerful, intelligent woman struggling against a patriarchal and colonial power, using the limited weapons at her disposal, her intellect, her charm, her body, in a desperate fight for national sovereignty. Hollywood, in turn, has created its own version, epitomized by Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal, the impossibly glamorous, tragic, romantic heroine caught in a love story of epic proportions. Each interpretation reveals more about the culture that produced it than it does about the historical woman herself. She is a mirror, reflecting back the anxieties and desires of each successive generation. A symbol of female transgression, a tragic lover, a colonial resistance fighter, a proto-feminist icon. Her true self remains elusive, buried under 2 millennia of legend and propaganda. So we return to the central paradox, the core question of her saga. Was she a cold-hearted political strategist, or a woman ruled by genuine, world-changing passion? The final, comprehensive answer is that this is a false dichotomy. To ask if she was one or the other is to impose a modern, Western distinction between love and politics that simply did not exist in her world, and especially not in her dynasty. For a Ptolemaic queen, love was politics. Romance was statecraft. She was the heiress to a 300-year-old family tradition where marriage and sexuality were, first and foremost, tools for acquiring and maintaining power. Her ancestors had married their own siblings to consolidate the royal bloodline. Alliances were sealed not with treaties, but in the marriage bed. She wielded her heart, her intellect, and her body as a unified weapon system, because in the brutal world she inhabited, they were utterly inseparable. She undoubtedly felt genuine affection, passion, and perhaps even love for both Caesar and Antony, 2 of the most charismatic and powerful men of their time. It would be impossible to maintain such intense, high-stakes relationships for years on pure pretense. But that passion was never separate from her ultimate political goal, the survival and restoration of her empire. She chose her partners not from a pool of eligible royal bachelors, but from the men who could offer her Roman legions and a guarantee of her throne. When she seduced Caesar in a carpet, it was a daring political move. When she appeared as Aphrodite to Antony, it was a masterful act of propaganda. When she had children with them, she was creating political heirs. The genius of Cleopatra was her ability to fuse the personal and the political so completely that no one, perhaps not even she, could find the line between them. She did not simply play with the hearts of emperors. She understood that in a world dominated by the overwhelming military force of Rome, the only battlefield where she, the ruler of a weaker state, could achieve victory was in the minds and hearts of the men who commanded those forces. Her strategy was a sublime, dangerous, and ultimately tragic fusion of love and power, a fusion that brought her to the brink of world domination, and in the end, led to her utter destruction. Ultimately, the saga of Cleopatra is more than the story of a single woman. It is the story of a clash of civilizations, the final, dramatic death rattle of the Hellenistic world, founded by Alexander the Great, as it was swallowed whole by the rising tide of the Roman Empire. She represents the last stand of a certain kind of power, the ancient, divine, monarchical tradition of the East, a world of god-kings, opulent courts, and a fusion of secular and religious authority. It was a world that was fluid, cosmopolitan, and deeply sophisticated, but also, by the 1st century BC, politically fragmented and militarily weak. Rome, embodied by Octavian, represented a new kind of power, organized, disciplined, militaristic, and legalistic. It was a power built not on the mystique of a divine ruler, but on the relentless efficiency of the legion, the rigidity of the law, and a collective civic identity that was, at its core, deeply suspicious of individual genius and monarchical ambition. Cleopatra's grand gamble was an attempt to merge these 2 worlds, to create a hybrid empire that would combine Roman military might with Greek culture and Egyptian wealth and divinity. Her union with Antony was the physical manifestation of this dream. Had they succeeded at Actium, the history of the West would have been profoundly different. The capital of the empire might have shifted to Alexandria. The dominant culture might have been Greek, not Latin. The political structure might have evolved into a divine right monarchy centuries before it did. But it was not to be. Her world, for all its ancient glory and intellectual brilliance, was swept away by the more pragmatic and ruthless power of Rome. The universal lesson of her life is a poignant one about the collision of eras and ideologies. She was a magnificent, brilliant product of a dying age, a final, dazzling flame of Hellenistic glory, before the long, orderly, and inexorable night of the Roman Imperium fell across the Mediterranean world. Her tragedy was not a personal failure of character, but the failure of an entire civilization to resist the inexorable march of history. The final frame, the image that endures long after the details of the battles and political intrigues have faded, is that of the aspo, a small, quiet, and distinctly Egyptian creature. It is not a Roman sword, the weapon that conquered her world, that ends her story. It is not a Greek cup of hemlock, the poison of philosophers. It is a creature of the Nile mud, a living symbol of the ancient chthonic gods of the land of Egypt itself. The venom of the asp is the final verdict of history, a quiet, potent rejection of the grand, hybrid world she tried to build. The dream of a Greco-Roman Egyptian empire, of Caesarion on a universal throne, of Alexandria as the capital of the world, all of it dissolves with that single sharp bite. The snake is the land of Egypt reasserting itself, reclaiming its last queen and pulling her back into its ancient mystical embrace, away from the harsh, unforgiving world of Roman steel. The shadow of the Ptolemies, which had stretched for 300 years, finally recedes, and the age of the pharaohs, an epoch of 3 millennia, comes to a silent, venomous end, not with a bang, but with a whisper, as a queen, dressed as a goddess, meets her gods in a stone tomb filled with gold, leaving the cold, practical Romans to inherit the world.